Chapter 1: The Abandonment of Hunter Biden. The telegram landed on President Trump's desk with the blunt force of a gavel. Executive Order 732, immediate withdrawal of USSS protection from Hunter Biden, currently in South Africa. Patel, FBI Director. Trump read it twice, a slow grin spreading across his face. His advisors had warned him that the optics were brutal, leaving the son of a former president, vulnerable in one of the most dangerous countries in the world, would be seen as reckless, even vengeful. But Trump saw something else. To him, this wasn't just about optics, it was an opportunity. Hunter Biden's history in South Africa was murky at best, riddled with rumors of illicit dealings and connections that had never been fully explored. Trump was convinced that, stripped of protection and desperate, Hunter would make a move, reach out to someone, run to an old contact, try to secure help. And when he did, Trump's allies would be watching, following the breadcrumbs, waiting for the moment to strike. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Cape Town, Hunter Biden felt the weight of his new reality settle over him like a suffocating fog. The sudden disappearance of his Secret Service detail wasn't just a bureaucratic decision. It was a death sentence. He knew the whispers, the lingering resentments, the grudges of those he had once crossed in pursuit of quick money. The cartels, the black market financiers, the underworld figures who had once welcomed him with open arms now saw him as nothing more than a loose end. And in South Africa, loose ends didn't last long. He checked his phone, half expecting a last-minute reprieve from Washington. There was nothing. No explanations, no reassurances, just silence. His pulse quickened. He had to move. Now. Because if he didn't, it wouldn't be long before someone else did. In Washington, Trump leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, waiting. In Cape Town, Hunter ran. And in the shadows, unseen forces were already closing in. The game had begun, and there was no telling who would survive it. Chapter 2: Hunter Biden. Finally facing reality. Desperate, Hunter Biden tried to call his father, but the line was dead. He stared at the screen in disbelief, his fingers trembling over the device as he dialed again. Still nothing. His breath hitched, panic clawing at his throat. He was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. The realization hit him like a gut punch. This wasn't just bureaucratic negligence. This was calculated. Someone, somewhere, had made the decision to cut him off completely. His father, the man who had always managed to shield him from the worst of his troubles, was unreachable. The comforting voice of the Secret Service agents who had followed him for years, the men and women who had stood guard, who had quietly ensured his safety even as he spiraled through scandal after scandal, were gone, and now his past had come back to haunt him. The whispers, the old debts, the grudges, none of it had ever truly disappeared. It had just been waiting. And now, without protection, without the shield of his last name or his father's influence, he was nothing more than a vulnerable, high-value target in a country where life was cheap and betrayal even cheaper. The weight of his actions, the reckless deals, the indulgent escapades, the blind trust in people who had once promised him the world, pressed down on him. He had always known that the people he had dealt with operated under an unspoken set of rules. Power was everything, and weakness was an invitation to be devoured. Now he was weak. Now he was exposed. Back in Washington, the political fallout was immediate and volcanic. The moment the news broke, Executive Order 732, the withdrawal of Hunter Biden's Secret Service detail, while he was in one of the most dangerous countries in the world, the Democratic Party erupted into a firestorm of outrage. The White House issued an emergency press briefing, scrambling to control the narrative. But the damage had already been done. This wasn't just a bureaucratic decision. It was a message. A warning shot fired by Trump, a ruthless display of power, a reminder that even out of office, even without the formal authority of the presidency, he could still move pieces on the board in ways no one else could. Former President Joe Biden, his face a mask of barely controlled fury, stepped before the cameras in the East Room, flanked by his closest advisors, his anger radiating beneath the surface of his carefully measured words. "This is beyond politics," he declared, his voice thick with restrained emotion. "This is about decency, about humanity, My son, regardless of his mistakes, regardless of what people think of him, is an American citizen. And President Trump has made a decision that directly endangers his life. This is reckless, this is cruel, and this is a new low, even for him. The air in the briefing room was thick with tension, reporters shouting over one another, demanding to know what the administration was going to do about it. Would they issue a counter-order? Could they override Trump's directive? The questions came fast, aggressive, a reflection of the deepening divide in the country, the sheer disbelief that a former president would wield his influence in such a way. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, Democratic lawmakers wasted no time launching a full-scale offensive. The House Minority Leader called an emergency press conference, flanked by key party figures, branding Trump's decision as a flagrant abuse of power and a politically motivated act of revenge. Senate Democrats drafted resolutions condemning the move, while legal experts debated whether any constitutional recourse could be taken to reinstate Hunter's protection. The term dereliction of duty was thrown around. Calls for investigations into Trump's continued influence over executive agencies gaining traction. But for all the outrage, for all the fiery speeches and threats of legal action, there was one grim, undeniable truth. Hunter Biden was still alone in South Africa, and every hour that passed only made the situation more dangerous. On the other side of the political battlefield, Trump and his allies were reveling in the chaos. From his gilded palace in Mar-a-Lago, Trump took to social media, issuing one bombastic post after another, framing himself as the ultimate truth-teller, the man finally exposing the corruption of the Biden family. Hunter Biden finally facing reality, he declared in one post. After years of lying, he's on his own. No more cover-ups, no more protection. His base devoured it, echoing his sentiment across the internet, conservative pundits amplifying the message. Trump's allies in Congress, led by some of his most vocal supporters, defended the decision, arguing that Hunter had been given preferential treatment for far too long, that the American taxpayer shouldn't be footing the bill for his security, that this was merely a matter of fairness. But everyone knew the truth. This wasn't about fiscal responsibility or bureaucratic oversight. This was about vengeance, and it was playing out on the world stage. As the crisis deepened, intelligence officials in Washington grew increasingly concerned. Behind closed doors, briefings were held on the potential threats to Hunter's life. The State Department was quietly working diplomatic channels, trying to gauge what options remained, but there was little they could do without direct authorization from the highest levels of government. Hunter's situation was precarious. South Africa was a country of deep contrasts, stunning landscapes, vibrant cities, but also vast criminal networks, shadowy figures who thrived on instability. And now they had been handed a golden opportunity, a high-profile target, alone, abandoned by his own government. It wouldn't take long for word to spread. Hunter knew this, felt it in his bones as he paced his rented villa, paranoia creeping in like a slow poison. He had contacts, of course, people he could call, favors he could attempt to cash in, but who could he trust? Who wouldn't turn on him the moment they realized how desperate he truly was? His father's political enemies, the opportunists who had circled him for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, now had all the leverage. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his life, there was no easy escape. He thought of his father's speech, of the outrage in Washington, but it felt distant, abstract. Words wouldn't protect him now. Speeches wouldn't shield him from the harsh reality on the ground. The night air in Cape Town was thick and humid as he stepped onto the balcony, his mind racing. He had to get out. He had to disappear before it was too late. But where? And more importantly, how? His passport, his connections, his once powerful last name, none of it felt like enough anymore. His enemies had waited for this moment, and now they were coming for him. In Washington, Biden and his allies fought to reverse the decision, to reinstate his protection. In Florida, Trump watched with satisfaction, waiting for the next shoe to drop. And in South Africa, alone and hunted, Hunter Biden realized he had just stepped into the most dangerous game of his life. Oh, Chapter 3. The Hunt for Hunter Biden. Privately, President Joe Biden was frantic. While he publicly condemned Trump's decision to strip Hunter of his Secret Service detail, behind closed doors, he was scrambling. He knew the truth. His son's dealings in South Africa were more than just personal missteps. They were entangled in a larger web of corruption, one that, if exposed, could devastate not only Hunter, but the entire Biden legacy. He couldn't afford for any of it to come to light. Desperation drove him to pull every string, cash in every favor, and lean on old contacts within the intelligence and diplomatic corps, searching for any way to extract Hunter before it was too late. But Trump's allies had already moved. FBI Director Kash Patel, a relentless operative with a singular focus on exposing the corruption tied to the Biden name, saw Hunter's vulnerability not as a humanitarian crisis, but as an opportunity. He knew that simply arresting Hunter wouldn't be enough. They needed irrefutable proof, something that could unravel the entire network. Patel deployed a covert FBI team, not to protect Hunter, but to monitor him, to track his movements, his calls, his desperate attempts to find a way out. He knew Hunter would reach out, to someone, somewhere, trying to buy time, trying to escape, and when he did, Patel's team would be there, gathering evidence, following every lead, waiting for the moment to strike. Meanwhile, Hunter, true to form, was spiraling. He tried to hire private security, but no firm would take the job, either out of fear of the powerful figures he had once worked with, or because they had already been bought off. He attempted to call in favors from former business partners, only to find their doors closed, their phones unanswered. His reputation had preceded him, and now, those who once benefited from his deals saw him not as a valuable asset, but as a liability. Trapped in a country where violence was currency and loyalty was fleeting, Hunter felt the walls closing in. In Washington, Biden fought desperately to reinstate his son's protection, to undo what Trump had set in motion. In Florida, Trump watched the chaos unfold with a calculated smirk, knowing that the longer Hunter remained exposed, the greater the chance that something, anything, would surface, something that could finally bring it all crashing down. And in Cape Town, Hunter's enemies had begun to move. The game had begun, and there was no telling who would survive it. Chapter 4. The Capture of Hunter Biden. The telegram had been the catalyst, but the real game had only just begun. Hunter Biden, now stranded in South Africa without the safety net of his Secret Service detail, found himself navigating a world that had long been his playground but was now a prison. His calls for help had gone unanswered, his father unreachable, his usual avenues of escape cut off one by one. The men he had once shaken hands with, the brokers, the fixers, the money launderers, they no longer saw him as an asset but as a liability. Desperation clawed at him as he moved through the back alleys of Cape Town, searching for a way out. But he wasn't just being hunted by those he had wronged. He was being watched. FBI Director Kash Patel had set the trap, and Hunter was walking straight into it. Patel's operatives, embedded throughout the city, meticulously documented his every move, listening in on his frantic phone calls, tracking the desperate meetings he arranged in an attempt to secure protection. What they uncovered was far beyond what even Patel had expected. The financial breadcrumbs led to a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and encrypted messages that pointed to something much bigger than just Hunter Biden. This was a network, a vast and intricate system of illicit dealings, foreign connections, and corruption that extended well beyond Hunter himself. Patel understood that simply arresting him wasn't enough. This was an opportunity to expose the entire operation, to bring down not just the son of a former president, but an entire web of influence that had shielded Washington elites for decades. The moment of reckoning came in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Johannesburg, a setting pulled straight from the pages of a spy thriller. It was there, under flickering fluorescent lights, that Hunter Biden made his last desperate gamble. He had arranged to meet with a man known only as the Broker, a figure whispered about in South African intelligence circles, someone who controlled access to the most dangerous criminal syndicates in the region. If anyone could get him out, it was the Broker. Hunter was willing to offer everything: money, information, secrets he had sworn never to reveal, all in exchange for safe passage out of the country before his past finally caught up with him. But what Hunter didn't know was that the Broker wasn't working for the criminals. He was working for Patel. The meeting had been a setup from the very start. Patel's team had meticulously orchestrated every step, leading Hunter to believe he still had options when, in reality, every choice he made only tightened the noose around him. As the deal was about to take place, the doors of the warehouse burst open. FBI agents flooded the room, weapons raised, voices shouting commands. Hunter barely had time to react before he was shoved to the ground, his arms wrenched behind his back. His first instinct was relief. Maybe this was a rescue. Maybe his father had pulled the right strings, reversed Trump's order, sent in reinforcements. But then he saw the expression on the agents' faces. They weren't there to save him. They were there to take him down. The broker, his demeanor calm and composed, stepped forward and handed over a USB drive to Patel's lead agent. It contained everything, irrefutable evidence not just of Hunter's crimes, but of a larger, more sinister network that implicated multiple high-ranking officials from the previous administration. This was more than just influence peddling. This was the smoking gun. In Washington, President Trump watched the news unfold with grim satisfaction. He had always suspected that Hunter Biden was the weak link, the key to unraveling the corruption he had long accused the establishment of fostering. And now, the truth was coming to light. The evidence recovered in South Africa was damning, enough to launch a full-scale investigation, not just into Hunter, but into his father's closest allies, into the intricate financial web that had protected them for years. As the news broke, Washington descended into chaos. Biden, still reeling from the loss of his son's protection, scrambled to contain the fallout. But the damage was already done. The narrative had shifted. This wasn't about political revenge anymore. This was about corruption at the highest levels, about secrets that could no longer be buried. Meanwhile, in a South African detention center, Hunter sat alone in a dimly lit holding cell, staring at the concrete walls, his mind racing. He had spent his entire life believing that, no matter how deep he fell, there would always be someone to pull him back up. But this time was different. This time, he was alone. His father's power couldn't reach him here, and the men who once considered him useful had now deemed him expendable. He had made mistakes, but none as grave as trusting the wrong people. And now, for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be abandoned. Back in Washington, Trump was already preparing his next move. The investigation would dominate the headlines, the hearings would be televised, the evidence would be laid bare. And as the walls closed in on Biden and his allies, Trump would stand before the cameras, his signature smirk in place, knowing that, for once, the system he had fought against was finally working in his favor. The game had changed, and there was no turning back. Chapter 5. The Fallout of the Savannah Gambit. The fallout was devastating. The shockwaves of Hunter Biden's arrest and the damning revelations that followed tore through Washington like a hurricane, uprooting careers, shattering reputations, and permanently altering the course of American politics. Several prominent Democrats, once considered untouchable, were forced to resign in disgrace. Their connections to the financial web unearthed in South Africa were undeniable. Offshore accounts, shadowy business deals, quiet backdoor agreements made in the name of influence and power. Some had been direct beneficiaries, others complicit in their silence, but none could escape the weight of the scandal. The resignations came in rapid succession, each one a political obituary scrawled across the front pages of the nation's newspapers. Those who remained in office scrambled to distance themselves from the wreckage, their once confident voices reduced to hollow denials and weak defenses. And then there was Joe Biden. Though not directly implicated in the corruption, he was nonetheless consumed by it. His legacy, once defined by decades of service, was now irreparably tainted by the reckless actions of his son. The image of America's steady hand, the man who had promised to restore dignity to the Oval Office, had crumbled under the weight of Hunter's sins. The speeches, the policy achievements, the years spent cultivating trust. It was all overshadowed. Biden's presidency, already battered by political strife and economic challenges, now bore an indelible stain, one that history would never fully erase. In private, he was devastated. In public, he was a man trying, and failing, to hold back the tide of inevitable ruin. As more information surfaced, painting a damning picture of Hunter's entanglements and the network that had shielded him for years, the calls for accountability grew deafening. The media, once Biden's greatest ally, turned against him, unable to ignore the magnitude of the scandal. His approval ratings plummeted, and the Democratic Party, once unified behind him, now whispered of alternatives, of distance, of survival. The walls were closing in. The party strategists knew that if Biden stayed in the race, he would drag them all down with him. What had once been a formidable campaign machine began to stall, its momentum crippled by the weight of an administration caught in a scandal too large to spin. While Biden's world collapsed, Donald Trump stood vindicated. The man who had spent years railing against corruption, who had vowed to expose the deep state and the political elite, had done exactly that. And now, standing before the American people, he prepared to deliver the final blow. The speech was carefully orchestrated, broadcast from the White House's East Room, every camera capturing the moment for posterity. Trump, a master showman, exuded confidence, authority, and triumph. He spoke of accountability, of justice, of the need to purge Washington of the corruption that had rotted its foundations for too long. He framed the scandal not as a partisan victory, but as a victory for the American people, a triumph of truth over deceit. For too long, the political elite have lied to you. They've stolen from you. They've betrayed you. And now, finally, we are holding them accountable, Trump declared, his voice steady, but electric with purpose. This is not about Republican or Democrat. This is about the soul of this country. And I promise you, we are just getting started. His words resonated beyond the walls of the White House. The nation, still reeling from the magnitude of the scandal, found itself looking at Trump not just as a leader, but as a historic force. He had gambled with Hunter Biden's life, orchestrating a masterstroke that forced the corruption into the light, and in doing so, he had reshaped the narrative of American politics. What had once been dismissed as conspiracy was now proven fact. The swamp was real, and he had drained it. The Savannah Gambit had worked. His enemies had fallen, his doubters had been silenced, and the people, those who had once questioned him, mocked him, resisted him, now saw the truth. They saw a man who had waged war against the establishment and won. They saw a leader who had exposed what no one else had the courage to confront. They saw in Trump something more than a politician. They saw an era-defining figure, one who had cemented his place in history. No longer was he just a former president fighting for relevance. Now, Trump was seen as one of the greatest presidents in American history. The Democrats, left in disarray, faced an identity crisis of catastrophic proportions. The party that had once prided itself on unity and control had been fractured from within, its strongest figures taken down in a scandal of their own making. Infighting broke out as the surviving leadership scrambled to contain the damage, pointing fingers, shifting blame, desperately trying to craft a strategy that could salvage what remained. There were those who wanted Biden to resign, to take responsibility and allow the party to rebuild. Others, more defiant, called for resistance, for an all-out war against Trump and his allies, painting him as an authoritarian who had weaponized the justice system for his own ends. But the public was no longer listening. The narrative had shifted too far, the revelations too damning. Voters who had once sworn loyalty to the Democratic Party found themselves questioning everything they had been told. They had watched as the media shielded the Bidens, as the political establishment covered for them, and now they saw it all unravel in real time. Faith in the system was eroding, and Trump had positioned himself as the only man who could rebuild it. As the dust settled, Trump's dominance was absolute. His approval ratings skyrocketed. His rallies drew record-breaking crowds, energized and hungry for more. The Republican Party, once fractured by internal disputes, now stood unified behind him, emboldened by victory. The midterms loomed, and Trump made it clear this was just the beginning. With control of Congress in sight, and the 2024 presidential race fast approaching, he was no longer just playing defense. He was on the offensive. He had the momentum, the narrative, and, most importantly, the unwavering loyalty of a movement that saw him as their only hope against a corrupt establishment. But even as Trump celebrated, his allies knew that the war was far from over. The deep state, the entrenched bureaucracies, the media elites, none of them would go quietly. There were whispers of counterattacks, of investigations aimed at undermining Trump's resurgence. Biden, though weakened, was still in power, and his remaining allies were desperate to hold the line. Legal challenges loomed, and while Hunter Biden sat in a prison cell awaiting trial, forces were already at work, trying to turn the tide, to rewrite the narrative once again. For now, Trump had won. But history had shown that in the ruthless game of American politics, there were no permanent victories. only battles, fought over and over again. And as Trump stood before the American people, basking in the triumph of his greatest political gambit, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The next war was already on the horizon,